Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and today's episode is being recorded very ad hoc. Apologies if it sounds a little bit different, if it comes out a little bit different. We're talking today about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is being recorded on the morning of February 24th. A lot of this really went down over the past 2 to 3 days, especially last night, in the middle of the night, United States time. And it's just an important topic to talk about. So that's what we're doing with today's episode. We're kind of interrupting our regular podcast schedule to talk about this. This is an out of sync, out of nowhere podcast, but this is one of the most important events that's happened in the last few decades globally. So here we are. To state the obvious, we're doing this because this is a historic event and it's really, really bad. What I'm not going to try to do in this episode is reporting. I'm not going to try to update you on the latest thing that's happened and where the Russians are and what the Russians are doing specifically and what the Ukrainians are doing in response, because anything I say is going to be out of date even before we release this. Even if we record it this morning and get it released in the afternoon, it will already be out of date. So that's not the goal. Things are moving too fast for up-to-the-minute reporting to really be the point of this podcast. It's funny, I tried to get a guest for this. We tried to get a guest for this podcast, and if you know anything about the podcast, the typical format is I'm talking to an expert. I'm talking to somebody who knows more than me. I'm rarely the smartest person on my own podcast, which is how I like it. You should not be talking to people who are dumber than you most of the time. You benefit more from talking to people who are smarter than you. But as you might guess, there's a couple reasons that's not happening. Number one, everyone is booked. Everyone is really busy who has expertise in this area. Number two, it's hard to find somebody who really knows what's going on. Right now, we are very much in the fog of war. We're very much in this space where nobody really knows. Nobody's sure exactly what's happening. We can speculate as to what the on-the-ground facts are. We can speculate as to what Putin's mindset is, but we don't really know. You know, a lot of this is speculation. And especially when we think about the long-term implications of this, we're all just kind of theorizing. Nobody really knows what the long-term implications are going to be. So it's hard to find an expert for that reason, and I couldn't find one even though I tried. So it's just going to be me today. But what I want to do, even if it's just me, what I want to do is talk about what this means for democracy and liberalism. You know, it's very strange when something big like this happens. I feel the need to go talk about it, and maybe that's weird. Maybe that's just my little personal quirk that I actually second guess myself, and I start thinking, why do you matter? What the hell does anybody care what you have to say, Jeremiah? Why do you need to run your mouth about this when everybody else has a take? Everybody else is running their mouth. What contribution do you have? But and maybe there's some validity to that. Maybe there is. But this is what I do. I have an audience for whatever reason. I don't know why you guys listen to me sometimes. But I have this audience, and hopefully I can impart some wisdom. I do think this matters. I do think it matters because this whole project that I'm involved in is about liberalism and democracy. And I think that we're entering a dangerous place for that. I think that there's a lot of things that need to be said about what this means for global liberalism and the fight between liberalism and authoritarianism. And this is a podcast dedicated to talking about that and dedicated to liberalism. And the Neoliberal Project, which I'm a part of, out of PPI, is an organization dedicated to advancing liberalism around the world. And a liberal democracy has been invaded by an authoritarian nightmare regime, and so we've got to talk about it. We've got to talk about what it means. So what do we know right now, if we just jump into it? The basic outline of what we know right now is that Russia seems to be doing a pretty full invasion of Ukraine. There's all sorts of reports right now, and the point of this podcast is not to provide you breaking news, because it's going to be stale. It's going to be stale by the time you read it, so the breaking news part is not important, but what I do want to do is talk about what it means. And the basic facts on the ground right now are that Russia has done a pretty full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's not just the two regions that are the breakaway regions, the rebel regions, so to speak. Rather than just invading those two regions that are the breakaway regions, Russia seems to have moved troops across the border from the south, from the west, and from the north. There are reports of Russian tanks entering Ukraine from Belarus to the north. There are reports of them breaking through the lines and trying to take over whole regions. There are reports of them bombing Kiev and bombing cities all the way in the far west of Ukraine. There's reports that they're crossing the border down in Crimea, which they've already seized. So this is basically a full-scale invasion. This is not a partial invasion. This seems to be done with the goal of taking over the whole country. And why does this matter? Why are we talking about it? Because liberalism is under attack. And this is happening all around the world, but let's start with Vladimir Putin. Let's start with him because he's the obvious case right now. To state things very, very simply, Vladimir Putin is a right-wing authoritarian. He runs a state, the Russian state, which you can accurately describe as fascist. You could accurately describe as totalitarian. You choose your word, but that's it. He's a murderer and a liar and has no respect for anything but naked power. That's who Vladimir Putin is. To just continue to be very clear, 100% of what's happening belongs to Russia. The blame is on them 100%. There's no NATO was mean. NATO was, mean girl to us. It's crap. It's crap. This claim that NATO did this somehow. The West was responsible. Western provocations. The relevant timeline for what's happened is this. Russia has historically treated their neighbors like crap. What do we mean by that? We mean genocide, imperialism, war, famine, death. All of these things Russia has done to their neighbors repeatedly throughout history. In Ukraine, the great example is the Holodomor, the self-imposed kind of state-directed famine that killed millions of people in Ukraine. That's one example among dozens of things that Russia has done to terrify and abuse their neighbors. Russia, in the modern world, is really angry that their neighbors don't like them. They're small neighbors who have much less land and much less population and much less power, don't like Russia, and those neighbors pursue ties with the West instead of with Russia. This could be economic ties, diplomatic ties, military ties. But these ties are democratically decided in places like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and it was beginning to be the case in Ukraine. They are alliances because these countries are historically scared and frightened of Russian aggression. Russia's response to this fear is to bully their neighbors and blame the West and then ultimately invade them. I just don't have any time for people who blame this on the West, who say, well, the nation that was invaded by Russians had it coming because they were trying to join this organization that was going to stop the Russian invasion. Like, I have contempt for that. As if the desire to join NATO could be proven correct in any factual sense. It's been proven correct. They should have been terrified of Russian aggression. Historically, it makes sense, and clearly it makes sense now. I have contempt. You are contemptible if you say that, the NATO provocations are what did this, as though there was not a legitimate reason for these countries to be afraid of Russia. So that's the clearest you can state it. 100% of the blame here belongs to Russia, and they own this, and we're going to talk about what happens next. There's a quote that I want to share. It's from Jean-Paul Sartre, and I probably pronounced that wrong. I'm sorry, I don't speak French. But Jean-Paul Sartre had a quote about anti-Semites and people who hate Jewish people. And specifically, the quote was about the way that anti-Semites argue in bad faith. And I think it's really applicable here. So I'm going to read you the whole quote, and I hope you hang with me. The quote goes like this. Never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for, by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their opponents. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, loftily indicating by some phrase that the time for argument is past. It is not that they are afraid of being convinced. They fear only to appear ridiculous or to prejudice by their embarrassment their hope of winning over some third person to their side. So that's the quote from Sartre about how anti-Semites delight in using bad faith and using ridiculous arguments. Their opponents are obliged to treat words seriously. Their opponents believe in words. The anti-Semite does not. And you can read this whole thing with Putin in mind. Never believe that Putin is unaware of the absurdity of his press. He knows that his press is frivolous, ridiculous, open to challenge, but he's amusing himself because it's the West who is obliged to take his press seriously because they believe in the free press. Putin has the right to play, to give ridiculous reasons, and by giving ridiculousness, discredit his opponents. He delights in acting in bad faith. All of this applies to Putin. All of it, 100%. And it's been one of the most striking things to me as I've watched this happen. As I've watched this whole process go down, what strikes me is that Russia is doing the world's worst imitation of a just war. And I'm doing air quotes there. Just war, or like a responsible intervention in air quotes. They're doing the worst mockery of that they can possibly do. But they feel the need to do it. They feel the need to provide some justification, but they delight in making it the stupidest justification they can. And they know that nobody's being convinced by this. It's just a fig leaf. But, they do things like say that there's a genocide going on in Ukraine against Russians. It's a completely made-up charge, completely made-up genocide. They make up a Nazi government. They say the Ukrainian government is controlled by Nazis, which is so sad because the current president of Ukraine is like his father, not his father. I believe his grandfather was in the Holocaust. I believe his grandfather he's a Jewish guy whose grandfather was in the Holocaust. And Russia's excuse for invading is that this is a Nazi government. There's other stuff where, they've done blatant false flag stuff that has literally been predicted ahead of time. So some Western intelligence agency will say there's going to be a bomb that goes off in this particular city. They're going to blame on the West. And also, on top of these blatant false flags, there's blatantly faked videos. Incredibly faked videos. I've seen a number of them where, they'll record something and release it as like a statement against this provocation that has just happened. And then you look at the metadata for the video, which they haven't even bothered to hide. And the metadata is like, oh, this was recorded 3 weeks ago. Like, they already knew which excuse they were going to use. They knew which city the supposed attack provocation was coming from, and they recorded it weeks ago. It's just ridiculous. It's a blatant degree of faking evidence that it doesn't even it takes internet sleuths less than 10 minutes to discredit these things. It's obvious. But, look, the West, the democratic liberal West, liberal democracies in general, they take it seriously. They take democracy seriously. They take claims of violence seriously. They take genocide seriously. They take evidence and reporting seriously. And so they're obliged to respond to all of this, to try to go point by point and talk about, is this legitimate or not? Russia doesn't care about any of this. Russia doesn't care. Putin doesn't care, but he knows we do. So he delights in doing this little song and dance, this version of, here's why I justify my war. It's just absurd and it's ridiculous. It's the same way that Sartre's anti-Semite delights in using bad faith rhetoric. Putin delights in using these sort of, I don't know, these, what would you call them? These tactics, I guess. One of the most depressing things to see is that it works. It works. It works, and there are people in the West who fall for it. Hook, line, and sinker. It's absurd at this point. I'm just going to go through some names. Like, there's the list of people who are trying to justify what Russia has done is absurd, and some of them are now trying to walk it back. Some of them are holding to it. I will distinguish between the people who got initially fooled during the buildup. Those people are camp number one, and there are some people who are initially fooled but have since come around and said, no, actually, Putin is a really bad guy. There's also a second camp that just continues to believe Putin is still justified, even now, even today. But there are people like, Hassan Piker, who streams under Hassan Abi, saying things like, Russia will never invade Ukraine. And I think he had something about how the Russian, grab of Crimea was totally justified. And he's basically just repeating Russian talking points. Every Russian talking point that Russian state media puts out there, he repeated for a while. He has since walked it back in several ways. I will give him the bare minimum amount of credit for that. Other leftist outlets have also done the same thing. Even this morning, I believe, Jacobin came out with an article that said, Putin is a really bad guy, but you should also save some blame for NATO. It's just absurd. And look, the left, unfortunately, is just infested with this stuff. Even the mainstream left in many countries. Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party in the UK for years and years, and he's out there talking about how every public statement he's put out up into the invasion, for weeks, every public statement that he put out was about how the Western media was pushing war. How is the Western media pushing war? The Western media is reporting on it. That NATO is being aggressive towards Russia. It just over and over, just repeating Russian talking points. The country that has now just invaded a country, Ukraine, for no reason. You even have idiots like the Gravel Institute putting out YouTube videos on how Ukrainians are Nazis. This is a video that was posted 4 or 5 days ago. 4 or 5 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, the Gravel Institute took notice of the situation and said, let's make a video on the Russia-Ukraine situation. And you know what the context of that video was? What the message of it was? It wasn't that, Russia's being really aggressive, or that Russia has historically beat up on and genocided and famined Ukraine. No, the message of the video, 4 days before Ukraine gets invaded by a hostile power, was Ukrainians are Nazis. The point was, that was the main point of the video. It's absurd. It's like they read Russian press releases and said, what can we do to just amplify every Russian talking point? And so this is a big, big problem on the left. It's also a problem on the right. I don't even know which is bigger, to be honest. It might be an even bigger problem on the right. It's hard to judge. But, Donald Trump has been out there basically licking Vladimir Putin's boots, just giving his boots the best tongue cleaning that they've ever seen. It is shameless how much he's licking Putin's boots. It's really bizarre. I've never seen anything like it. An American president talking about how Putin is strong and smart and amazing, and look how incredible this invasion is. Look how smart and great he is for doing this. It's frightening. It's really frightening. And, thank God we have Joe Biden as president rather than Donald Trump, where Donald Trump would probably just repeat the talking points from Russian media and be like, no, Putin is right to do this. Putin is correct to do this, because that's what he's saying now. Tucker Carlson, who's one of the biggest cable news people in the world, Tucker Carlson reads off Russian talking points and openly sides with them on air, repeatedly. He has said on air, I'm on Russia's side. He has repeated, this was not this year, but in a previous year, he said, I'm on Russia's side, specifically talking about Russia versus Ukraine. It's bizarre. It's really bad on both sides, and not to be the both sides centrist, but it is genuinely really bad, and it is happening on both sides. And it's weird. I don't feel like you see dirtbag centrists taking Russia's side. I don't feel like you see moderates taking Russia's side. This is only an extremist thing. And that's the saddest thing, is that all this misdirection that Russia does, all this really blatantly obvious crap about how Ukraine is threatening us, and Ukraine is doing a genocide, and Ukraine is a bunch of Nazis, people fall for it. Extremists on both ends of the political spectrum fall for this kind of stuff, and it's really sad. And very rarely do you see these people actually walk it back. Even when they kind of go quiet, delete the bad tweet, start to say the right thing, they never actually, rarely do they come out and say, well, I guess I was wrong, I guess you pointed out some really obvious propaganda that I was repeating, but I should have listened to you. But no, that they never say that. It's weird. On the right, it seems to be like a trend towards authoritarianism. On the right, it's number one, it's Trump's influence. Trump individually is responsible for a lot of this problem, because Donald Trump has a strange just affinity for every strong man that he can find, whether it's Kim Jong-un or Putin or whoever. And beyond just Trump individually, which is a big problem, it's also just this trend towards authoritarianism. The intellectual energy, such as it exists on the right, tends to be with the NatCons, the national conservatives, who basically are openly authoritarian. They're the people who think that, we should have less democracy, in the sense of we should be like Viktor Orban in Hungary. Some of them even outright have started praising the CCP. There was a report the other day where some of the usual nationalist voices in America, Sohrab Ahmari, Adrian Vermeulen, those were literally praising a report about how China's system works and how it's built for the common good, and the Chinese understand the common good. Just these people are open authoritarians. On the left, you typically see it more as an anti-Americanism, as an overriding force. I think this is just, I don't know, it's an instance of fighting the last war sometimes. A lot of people are stuck in Iraq, and we're always learning the lessons of the last war, right as it's time to learn different lessons for the new war. This happens a lot in politics. I think a lot of people are stuck with Iraq brain, where America did some bad stuff in Iraq, and the invasion of Iraq was likely not justified. I'm not going to get into that now, whether you believe it was or it wasn't, but a lot of people really strongly believe it wasn't. That has come to be the dominant view. And it's turned into just kind of a blanket anti-Americanism. In this kind of worldview, anything is good as long as it's against the US. As long as it's anti-American in some way, they cheer for any terrible thing. It can be Russia, it can be, hell, there's people who cheer for North Korea, as bizarre as that is. And that's not every leftist, but this is a general trend that just, if something can be described as, anti-imperialism or anti-Western, anti-United States, anti-NATO, a lot of people will just kind of drink it up. Even if it's not real anti-imperialism, even if it's just Vladimir Putin waving his hand at kind of being anti-imperialism in a very dismissive way, people on the left will still eat it up until he actually goes and invades another country. So yeah, Russia does this deliberately. They do this sort of bad faith argumentation deliberately, and our extremists eat it up, and I don't know what to do about it. This is part of a broader struggle. there is a worldwide struggle going on between democratic liberalism, and I mean that in the broad sense, in the sense that, Scandinavia are liberal democracies. You could call them social democracy, or you can call them whatever you want, but they are liberal democracies in the sense that they have democratic values, elections, free speech, freedom of the press, free and fair gathering, and freedom of religion, and all these things. They are liberal democracies. Japan is a liberal democracy. United States is a liberal democracy. And these places can be more or less conservative, more or less social welfare oriented, but they share a certain baseline set of values, right? And there's a struggle between the liberal democratic world and the illiberal authoritarian world, anti-liberalism and authoritarianism. And you can see this in kind of a grand sweep of history view. There's China and Russia and others who are explicitly trying to build a world and trying to build a future without liberalism, without meaningful democracy. This is a thing that countries are trying to do. And again, they have Western allies. They have allies in the West who try to help them along with this. There's the right, especially all over the world, has fallen into authoritarianism. We talked about the U.S. national conservatives openly praising communist China and openly praising Russia and Hungary, which is, it's just beyond the pale. Who would have thought that right-wing politics would have fallen into praising the communist Chinese party? I can't even deal with it. It's so absurd. In the U.S., it's with, the NatCons and Trumpism, but it's not just the United States. It's Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's Duterte in the Philippines. It's Erdogan in Turkey. It's Modi in India. It's European far-right parties that have been on the rise. UKIP in England, Le Pen in France. I think it's the National Front there in France. Which, by the way, there has actually been reporting that, Marine Le Pen is, literally funded by Russia. That her party literally accepts Russian funding. It's the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the AfD. Some of these are worse than others. Not all of these are at the same level of badness. But the trend is in that direction. The trend is that the right wing in American and worldwide politics has become more authoritarian. The trend is not good. Just to put it simply. Democracy and liberalism are under attack. And I really believe deep in my bones that the great project of the next generation is to defend it internationally and at home. This really seems like another Cold War. It seems like we're in for another Cold War. And that's on Russia. That's on China. And we may even have to fight part of it at home. If the previous Cold War was the capitalist West versus the communist East, and eventually capitalism wins, liberal capitalism, liberal democratic capitalism wins, the next one is between liberalism and illiberalism. The idea that states should just be totalitarian and authoritarian. And again, this is not just something that China and Russia want to do for themselves. They want to build a world without liberalism. China wants to export their model of government. It's a goal. This is very much an ideological war worldwide, and I pray to God it will never be fought with bullets, even though it already is in Ukraine. I hope it's just a Cold War, but this is the conflict that I believe will be defining a lot of our generation. So, if you're the United States, if you're the Western world in general, if you're a liberal democracy, what should you do? That's one of the big questions on everyone's mind. What should the Western world do? I want to say up front, I am not a foreign policy expert. I'm not an expert in the technical aspects of how sanctions work. So please forgive me here if I'm a little bit loose on the details, if I state things in the way that's not precise and technically accurate. Please forgive me that as I mentioned earlier, we tried to get a guest on this episode of the podcast, and because we're trying to get it out very quickly, we weren't able to get anybody in time. But I do think there's a conceptual way this should work. And the concept here is to isolate Russia. Completely isolate Russia. Completely. I really want to emphasize that. As close as we can, we should try to make them North Korea. Cut off everything. Everything completely, as much as possible. I'm talking about if you do business in Russia, business of any kind, you are barred from doing business in the U.S. You are barred from the U.S. financial system, from United States banks. What does this mean? This means their banks. Cripple their banks. I think there's something called SWIFT that's really important to the international payment system. They should be kicked out of it. Cripple their banks and their financial system. Completely cut them off. Oil and gas. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline for oil and gas is already down. It's already dead. But I mean, shut down oil and gas coming from Russia to the Western world, period. Europe needs to stop buying oil and gas from Russia, just period. And look, I know they have to get their energy from somewhere. If we need to move heaven and earth to find alternatives, so be it. Make a new Marshall Plan, if needed, for European energy. Make a Manhattan Project for how do we get Europe energy without Russia. But we have to figure it out. We have to cut that off. And beyond just banks, beyond just oil and gas, I'm talking everything. Technology companies should not be allowed to operate in Russia. Apple should not be allowed to sell iPhones there. McDonald's and Coke and Levi's jeans, everything. Like, shut it down. If Russia is going to be invading other sovereign countries, liberal democratic sovereign countries, invading them because they don't like the outcome of the free election that Ukraine had, then they can't be part of the international system. I don't see how that can possibly be allowed. Other countries that do business with important Russian areas like finance, oil, should also be punished. As much as we can, just punish them as well. Let's make China choose. Does China want to do business with Russia? Or do they want to do business with the United States and Europe? We should make China choose, because China will chicken out. China will choose us if we force them to. China's not giving up the European and American markets, because Russia's GDP isn't big enough for them to care. Even if you view China as a completely selfish, rational actor, or a selfish, irrational actor, they're not going to kill the golden goose. I mean, ultimately, there's no simpler way to say this other than Russia is an authoritarian, nuclear-armed state invading its democratic neighbor for no reason other than to annex their land. We don't know yet whether it's going to be in part annex their land, just some of them, or in whole, if they want to annex all of Ukraine, or if they want to set up a puppet government and just overthrow the government, but it's unacceptable. The international community cannot abide this. We cannot continue doing business with Russia as though things are normal. I also think that Russian oligarch holdings should be seized. There's a lot of kleptocrats. You can call them there's different names for them. Billionaires, kleptocrats, oligarchs. But these are the very, very rich people, I'm going to call them oligarchs, that empower Vladimir Putin. They're his base of power, more than anything. They own the critical industries in Russia, and they own things in the United States and Europe, too. These are very, very rich men who care about their luxuries. They own homes in New York and London and Rome. They own things. They own buildings. They own companies. They own assets in our system. They keep their money here. And, funny side note, if they kept their assets in Russia, Putin could seize them anytime he wanted to, because Putin controls all of Russia. So they keep assets in Western banks. They buy property in Western countries. This is how they keep their money away from Putin, because Putin can't just order Citibank to turn over $1 billion of assets. But because of this, they empower Putin, even while they're scared of him at the same time. We should seize everything that we can. Seize their accounts, seize their holdings, their property, their football clubs. Seize Chelsea. Roman Abramovich is an enabler for Vladimir Putin. He's one of Putin's friends. And we should seize Chelsea Football Club. The UK government should do that. It's an incredibly drastic step. Look, what I'm saying here is a drastic move, but this is essentially who runs Russia. It's Putin, a couple dozen to a couple hundred oligarchs are really the ones who matter. Somewhere between 30 and 300, I'd guess. I don't know exactly how many it would be, but, seize their yachts, seize their accounts. You don't get to prop up a man like Putin and then also enjoy the fruits of the West. It's a drastic move, but I don't know why they should be allowed to participate in the wealth and the stability of a liberal democratic system when they are actively trying to tear down that system with military force. So that's some of what I think should be done. This is my personal opinion. I'm not making statements for everybody who calls himself a neoliberal. People are going to have some good faith disagreement on exactly how far we should go. And that's fine. That's normal. This is what I think. And are we going to get all of this? No. We're not going to get all these things. We're not going to get as drastic as I want. But I believe we should try. We should try to get as close as we can to making Russia North Korea. This is a game theory situation. We need to create a world where it is well known that if you invade your neighbors like this, you are met with swift, brutal economic sanctions. It has to happen fast and it has to be hard and overwhelming. And if that happens, that's a good thing, because the world is safer when people know this kind of invasion is met with brutal sanctions, rather than a world where this kind of invasion is met with weak, meaningless sanctions. Again, I apologize for not being an expert here in terms of the exact technical aspects of how sanctions work, because the global financial system is complicated, and I don't know the whole detail. So apologies for that, but I believe very strongly that's the direction we should go in. Really, really very harsh sanctions on Russia's entire economy. So to wrap this up, this podcast episode that we're putting together on very short notice, and I hope it's been okay. I hope it hasn't been too disjointed. I mostly just want to communicate at the end how sorry I am for the people of Ukraine. It's horrible. The people of Ukraine are going to be undergoing a lot of suffering, and it's terrible. It's terrible, and the first and most obvious thoughts go to them. People are already dying in Ukraine. Ukrainians have already died. They will continue to die as this happens. There will be Ukrainians who are crippled, who have limbs blown off, who lose loved ones, who undergo incredible trauma. The Ukrainian economy is going to be in tatters, which means, in a real sense, poverty and hunger will skyrocket. There will be children in Ukraine who go hungry because of this. It's awful, and my heart goes out to them. The other sad thing is that nobody wins here. It's not like Ukraine is losing and somebody else is winning. Nobody wins. Not even Russia. Not even the people in Russia win. One other thing I want to say before I move on is that there's likely to be a refugee crisis, and I hope it's just a small one. But it may end up being a really big one. And the United States especially should take in Ukrainian refugees. We should be preparing for this now, before it's a crisis. And all rich countries, I think, should have this responsibility. I think it's a moral responsibility. A moral responsibility for rich countries to take in Ukrainian refugees. But as I was saying, it's not good for anybody. The international order is going to suffer for this. This is not good for other third countries that even if you're not involved, the international order is going to be destabilized because of this. it's hard to predict the broad ramifications here, but you have to think that this leads in bad directions. You have to think that this is going to make the rest of the world a more dangerous place, a less secure place. Even if we can't say exactly how that's going to happen right now, the likelihood is that it does happen. And look, the saddest thing is that this isn't even going to be good for the Russian people. What does an everyday Russian get out of this invasion? What does a Russian get out of this? You know, Russia's GDP has already fallen by a third in the last decade. And some of that is because of sanctions and because Russia is isolating themselves from the West. And look, some of it is, you know, things like oil prices or currency fluctuations or whatever. You can debate exactly what it's meant for living standards, but their top-line GDP in US dollars has fallen by a third. Living standards have declined since 2008. Like, Russia's GDP has been stagnant for like 15 years now. They're already economically suffering, and their economy is going to get hammered even more by this. I don't know what the number is going to be when you're listening to this, but the Russian stock market fell by 50% at one point today. 50%. 50. I've never seen a stock market lose 50% of its value in a day in any country. And look, what does this mean? Russia's economy is going to get hammered. That means millions of Russians are going to lose their jobs. It means more poverty. It means more hunger, more suffering. Again, there will be children in Russia who go hungry because this war started, who are not, you know, in the war themselves, but this is real things. When the economy goes down, real people suffer. Nothing about this is going to be good for a Russian citizen. It is only benefiting whatever insane recreate the Soviet Union kind of vision that Vladimir Putin has. And I gotta say, I don't even understand it. I don't understand what Putin thinks is going to happen here. Russia's military is bigger and badder than Ukraine's, and he can probably overrun it at some point. But does he think he's going to hold the whole country? You know, the lesson of the U.S.'s adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq is how hard it is to hold countries that don't want you there. And look, Ukraine's population is bigger than both of those countries. Especially, it's bigger today. It's especially bigger than it was when we invaded those countries, you know, when the United States overthrew Saddam Hussein and took out the Taliban, you know, 20 years ago. Russia does not have the capability, as far as I understand it, to, you know, just pacify 40 million Ukrainians. 44 million Ukrainians, I think, is the exact number. It seems kind of impossible to just hold onto that territory when they hate you. So I'm not a geopolitical expert. I don't really know what's going on here. So take this with a grain of salt, but it sure seems like a terrible move to try to occupy long-term a country of 40 million people that hates you. Seems like a recipe for disaster. So I just wonder what the actual plan is. Are you going to only annex the rebel regions? Are you going to try to annex all of Ukraine? Are you going to set up a puppet government that is loyal to Russia and kills its own citizens when those citizens inevitably reject the puppet government, which they will, which is going to just turn into a Ukrainian civil war between collaborators and patriots? I don't know. I don't know what the plan is, but nothing about what I've seen makes me think that Vladimir Putin is acting rationally in the sense that we understand it. To close, I don't know. I'm just tired and I'm sad. This sucks, and I don't know what else to say, and there's not much we can do in the short run. You know, nobody in the United States or the West is talking about military intervention. It's not a serious opinion. Nobody in the West is threatening to get involved and put Western soldiers in Ukraine. I don't think there's much we can do in the short run. I would say advocate for harsh sanctions. I can tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to call my congressperson and advocate for harsh sanctions on Russia and on Belarus. I'm going to advocate for accepting refugees. I'm going to call my congressperson, my senator, my governor, and talk about the need to accept refugees. I'll also say to everyone out there, if your mental health is impacted by this, if this is stressful, I would recommend just staying away from the news. A lot of us have the instinct to just follow it 24/7. Some people call it doom scrolling. Just scroll Twitter, scroll Reddit over and over, read, feel an impending sense of doom, keep scrolling. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. It doesn't gain you anything to follow this beat by beat. You don't have to know every single thing immediately. It does not benefit you. You're going to be okay if you just check in once every day in the morning, and then you don't have to read it the rest of the day, or check in at night and then you don't have to read it the rest of the day. That's fine. You're allowed to do that. And if your mental health is going to be impacted by that, I just want you to take care of yourself, because there's a lot of people who will feel a lot of stress from this. So maybe you're fine doom scrolling. Maybe it doesn't impact you and that's your personality. But if it's going to impact you, please just take care of yourself. Take care of the people around you. Just try to be kind to people around you. You never know who might be feeling a lot of stress from this, who might have family in a bad situation. So be kind to people. A little kindness to a stranger can really be meaningful, even if you don't end up seeing the impact. So it's kind of universal advice, but just try to be kind. And that's all I've got for you. I don't know much else to say other than this is terrible and I wish it wasn't happening. And I hope it resolves soon. I hope it resolves soon and that the fighting stops. So I think that's going to be the podcast for now. And I hope it was valuable to somebody out there. Like I said, this is stuff that weighs down on me. I really think that it's important to defend liberalism internationally. And that's what we're going to be doing in the Neoliberal Project. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back to our regular podcast next week.